70 years of research had looked at human behavior, research, reactions, what happens when you do whatever. And before they'd adopt any practice, they would go out and look and see the before and after, do an analysis, because many things that people thought would be obviously safety items, they would have unintended consequences. And it was so many things, it was just counterintuitive, you would think, were having really serious negative consequences. So when we went to 55-mile-an-hour speed limits, the highway department stopped doing the safety audit, stopped doing the accident reviews. More importantly, the worst thing that happened is the data collected by the officers matched a checklist of approved items that they were supposed to report on an accident and got rid of many of the key items that actually were relevant. In other words, they stopped reporting that the highway condition or a condition at a particular intersection contributed to an accident. They never did any forensic analysis of what contributed to the accidents prior. But none of that ever made it into the system. Then they start changing everything to be driver related when much of it wasn't. Then they started using related in the reports, which means that the actual core cause didn't support their conclusions. The one that really most upset me was that on one particular highway, I'm a Nevada person, one particular highway, a young couple died on a road where the traffic was doing 70 miles an hour or more, even during the 55. I mean, people didn't change the way they drove back then. And a young couple went off the road in a curve that was unmarked because they didn't mark anything above 55, but nobody was driving 55. Then California had a bunch of units that sections of roadway that having extremely high accidents on curves. There in Nevada, they had one roadway posted 50 and not 55 because they wanted to write tickets. And it had 9 curves that were unsafe, and over 35% of the accidents were curve related. And to this day, 50 years later, they haven't marked a single one. In fact, the irony there, I used to joke that if your grandfather was working this place at the speed trap at the bottom of the hill, then, you know, they're still working, the grandkids are still working the same damn place. And the problem is they've made the intersection down there a death trap. They took out the safety valves on it. We report it, they do nothing. But they increased the citations at the bottom of the hill. Well, that's not the problem with the accidents ever. You know, I was driving 70, 100,000 miles a year, and I was seeing every single traffic type of accident. Oregon was particularly bad. California was particularly bad. Oregon was one of the worst because their roadways were a little bit too narrow in places, and they had all the trucks. In fact, all speed limits, other than one interstate back then, was 55. And of course, back then, everything was 55. But what was happening is people would be driving along whatever their natural speed is, and they'd get to a slow-moving truck and they'd have to overtake it. The passing zones were too short. They didn't represent the actual travel speeds of the cars, didn't have overtaking. You couldn't see past the trucks because they were too close to the center line. You didn't have sight distance. So most of their fatalities were policy and design problems that they were causing the motorists to increase the number of high-risk overtakings just to get where they think they needed to go in a reasonable time. So the unintended consequences were massive. Not only that, the slowing down of the speed. So people, when they're looking for an officer all the time, are under more stress. When they're driving at a speed that they're not comfortable with and driving slower than normal, it increases stress. The number one killer out there on many of these highways on the open road were fatigue, sleep deficit, medical problems, diabetes, other things that were occurring. And if it takes 6 hours and a half to take a trip, then the next thing you know, you're doing 7.5 hours to do the same distance. Actually, when it's 55, it was even worse. You've increased the highest risk activity, which is driving fatigue or long periods.